The winter of 1853 had stripped Dalebridge to its bare bones. The river froze in its bed, the trees cracked like old joints under the weight of ice, and the air itself seemed brittle enough to shatter with a single breath. At the edge of town, past the last shuttered cottages and the blackened husks of harvested fields, the parish of St. Bartholomew's stood alone, its stone walls furred with frost, its steeple fixed like a needle in the pale sky. Beyond it, half buried in the snow, stood 29 wooden crosses, each no taller than a man's chest, each with a single number carved deep into its face. No names, no dates, only ages 7, 12, 4, 9, spaced unevenly like a sequence meant to be read but never understood. The wind carried the faint odor of burnt wood from somewhere far beyond the tree line, but no one claimed to notice. The townsfolk did not visit the field, even those whose own children had once vanished from their beds, whose hearts had gone cold waiting for footsteps that never returned, would not go there. They crossed themselves when passing the parish, eyes fixed on the road, lips pressed thin. They told outsiders that the field was consecrated, that those crosses marked the victims of a fever or an orphan's plague brought in from another county. But there had been no fever, and the cemetery behind the town's general church showed no sign of overcrowding. St. Bartholomew's kept its dead separate, as if these were not to be mixed with the rest. Snow blanketed everything in silence, yet the silence was not empty. It was listening. Windows facing the parish were kept shuttered even during daylight, as if some trace of what stood in that field might drift inside like chimney soot and stain the walls. On rare days when the wind changed, children claimed they could hear something faint, like the creak of rope or the brittle sound of ice shifting on a pond. Their parents told them it was just the wind scraping the wooden beams of the old church roof. The Reverend of St. Bartholomew's, Elias Whitford, had been in Dalebridge for over a decade by that winter. He was a man of about 50, with hair thinned at the crown and pale eyes that seemed both warm and unreadable. In public he was gentle-spoken, never raising his voice from the pulpit, never shaming a parishioner for their sins. He visited the sick, carried bread to widows, and once spent 3 nights digging out the Carter family's cabin after a snowstorm. People trusted him in the way one trusts the slow turn of the seasons, quiet, dependable, inevitable. But behind the church's heavy oak doors there was another season entirely, one that did not thaw with spring. Those who had served under him longest knew of his routines. The cellar doors bolted after the 4th bell. The late-night flicker of candlelight through the chapel's stained glass. The way he always walked the perimeter of the church before dawn, brushing his fingers along the foundation, stones as if feeling for a heartbeat beneath them. His quarters smelled faintly of cold iron, and though the church stove burned all winter, there was always a chill in the air below the sanctuary stairs. No one spoke openly about the crosses. They had begun appearing in the early 1840s, 1 or 2 each year, always after the first snow. No one saw who placed them. Some claimed to have glimpsed a shadow moving in the field by lantern light, but the figure never left footprints. Each new cross was found planted deep into the frozen ground, the number carved cleanly as if by a steady, patient hand. They were never removed, even when the wood began to rot. Reverend Whitford himself blessed each one, sprinkling it with water from the stone font, his expression unreadable. By 1853, the oldest crosses had tilted in the wind, their numbers softened by frost and rain. Yet the newer ones stood straight as if resisting decay. The field seemed to grow larger every year, though no one could explain why. The ground stretched flat and white, yet those who approached swore it sloped subtly downward toward the church, drawing the eye to its cellar windows, half buried in drifts. It was in that year's deepest winter, when the snow rose to the height of a man's thigh and the river froze solid enough to bear a cart, that the 29th cross appeared. It bore the number 6. No one asked whose age it marked. They never did. The town had learned the rhythm, across a blessing silence, and then waiting for the next. From the road, St. Bartholomew's looked almost kind beneath its crown of snow, its steeple catching the pale gold of the low sun. But the closer one came, the more the air seemed to thin and the cold to deepen. Not the biting cold of wind, but the still absolute cold of a place that had forgotten warmth. In the parish records there was no mention of the field, no record of the children, no cause of death. The paper smelled faintly of salt when handled, as if it had been kept too close to the sea, though Dalbridge lay hundreds of miles from any shore. The 29 crosses stood in their uneven rows, the snow curling at their bases like pulled cloth. And though the town would tell itself year after year that the field was nothing but an old plague yard, there were those who knew better. The Reverend's smile at the Sunday service was the same one he wore when the 29th cross was planted. Soft, patient, and as cold as the frost clinging to the wood. Reverend Elias Whitford learned to hold his smile the way other men held their breath, calm and steady, until the moment passed and no one remembered the air had thinned. He came to Dalebridge with a trunk, a travel Bible, and a transfer letter praising his gentleness with the poor, and the town welcomed him like warm bread accepts a knife. He moved with care as if every gesture had a quiet purpose, setting his hat down with both hands, pausing at doorways, listening, longer than necessary. He asked after old injuries, remembered small losses, mended rails for widows, and bowed his head when thanked. Slowness became his language, and the people mistook it for patience, never guessing it was also a gate that only he could open. Beneath St. Bartholomew's, the cellar kept a different season. Elias learned its stones as a surgeon learns his tools, running his fingers along mortar lines, counting paces, mapping where the frost held past dawn. He called its deepest chamber the winter room, never allowed, only in the thin script of his private journal. There he wrote of a silence that, if kept clean of heat and motion, could hold the soul at its purest point. He called that point the threshold, and believed that if one could arrive there, not a breath early, not a breath late, the soul could be kept in perfect stillness, neither in life nor beyond it. The idea had been born from a boyhood winter when his mother's body, left under a basin of frozen water for the night, looked fresher than it had in years. He never described her death, only the way the ice had pressed time flat. That memory hardened into a doctrine. In the winter room, Elias studied time without clocks. He filled a thin vial from the font and waited for the moment the water's rim turned dull. He timed the swing of a brass weight against his pulse and marked his wrist with faint ink crosses to track the beat. He tested the air with a hanging ribbon, If it hung still, the room was ready. And readiness meant rules. Cellar doors locked at the fourth bell. Heat dampened to a steady chill. Salt jars sealed to drive out moisture. Iron fittings scrubbed until they smelled of nothing at all. He began with small trials. A sparrow fallen from the eaves, a lamb born too soon, a fox that had curled into sleep and never risen. He studied how the body settled into cold, how breath thinned before stopping, how skin kept its shape when cooled slowly. Above ground, Elias was the parish shepherd. He grew the choir, smiling at shy voices, feeding the children warm bread, telling them that God liked soft sounds. He was not listening for beauty but for stillness, the child who could hold a note without swaying, who stood patient in pauses, who did not search for approval. He visited homes and left food, eyes on the parents, learning which families kept their children close and which let them wander. He learned the paths through snow that left no prints, stepping from drift to drift on wind-hardened crust. He learned the church bells well enough to make them kiss without ringing, marking hours only he could hear. In his mind, none of this was cruelty. The world, he believed, wasted grace by letting it fade in noise and heat. Winter was the clean cloth over the face of time. A soul could be guided to the edge and held there until everything harsh fell away. He smiled because smiling kept others from looking too closely. When the town praised his patience, he accepted it like a tool pressed into his palm. In his journal, he sketched an iron cradle with shallow curves, not for comfort but for stillness, and listed supplies that would seem ordinary to anyone else. Linen cut into narrow bands, nails filed smooth, glass worn enough to cool a wrist. He wrote that voices in the cold became pure, almost holy, as if the throat were an instrument waiting for the right room. And always, beneath the neat rows of his handwriting, was the quiet certainty that the first vessel would come soon, and that the number on its cross would matter less than the shape of its silence. Dalebridge was not a town that asked questions. Questions meant standing still in the open while the wind clawed at your ears, meant forcing your eyes toward things you could not fix. The people learned to keep their heads bent in winter, to walk quickly between door and door, and to speak in low tones about anything that lingered too long in the mind. That habit was why St. Bartholomew's thrived without scrutiny. The Reverend's rules for his helpers were as fixed as the church's timbers. No one was to open the cellar doors after the fourth bell. No one was to be inside when the chapel candles burned past midnight, and no one, not even the most trusted altar boy, was to handle the keys to the winter room. Most accepted these as harmless traditions, like not sitting in the front pews or never ringing the bells during Lent. The Reverend's voice made them sound like holy law, his tone steady and kind, as though he were keeping them from burdens they were not ready to bear. Those who worked closest to him noticed small oddities. The choir children who sang the clearest notes were sometimes called for private practice in the evenings, and though they returned home the same night, their parents said they were quieter afterward, less quick to laugh. The church's supply cellar seemed to draw more salt than flour, more iron nails than candles. Each year, as the first snow settled, the Reverend would disappear for a day or two, returning with his boots clean but smelling faintly of smoke and wet stone. He would spend the next Sunday sermon speaking gently about purity, about how God's true kingdom was a place of stillness, untouched by the decay of the world. No one in Dalebridge had forgotten the disappearances. Children gone from their beds, seen last at the river or in the fields, their tracks swallowed by the weather. But the Reverend had been there to console the parents, to speak of God's mysterious timing, to stand with them at the threshold of their grief. Some even came to see the crosses behind the parish as a mercy, that at least someone marked the loss, even if not by name. The town convinced itself that the children's bodies rested beneath those markers, that the church had simply chosen privacy over spectacle. The truth was simpler and far worse. The ground beneath each cross had never been disturbed. The parish women who cleaned the church sometimes heard faint tapping from below as they scrubbed the nave floor. The sound would come in irregular bursts, like a single drop of water striking a basin, but always stopped when someone tried to follow it. The men who maintained the grounds learned not to question why the cellar windows were nailed shut from the inside. Even the sheriff, a man not easily cowed, avoided lingering after dark, muttering that the church's shadow seemed to stretch farther than it should. Yet life went on, and the Reverend's smile never faltered. He presided over weddings and baptisms, blessed the planting season, and offered bread and soup to travelers who stopped for shelter. He kept the parish warm enough to draw people in from the cold, but never so warm that the chill left their bones entirely. And while others busied themselves with the day's survival, he tended to his quiet work in the winter room. He believed the parish's willingness to look away was proof that his purpose was righteous. God had made them blind to preserve the work. Every winter the choir's numbers grew smaller. Families told themselves it was the weather, the long walks to the parish, the illnesses that seemed to catch hold in the lungs of the young. When the Reverend suggested prayers for our absent voices, the congregation bowed their heads, murmuring in unison. No one asked who was missing or why their absence felt heavier than mere distance. The field of crosses remained in plain sight, yet somehow belonged to another world. In spring, the thawing earth softened around them, but no flowers grew there. In summer, the grass grew in uneven patches, as if the soil itself rejected roots. Autumn winds carried leaves from the parish trees into the field, but they always seemed to settle against the church wall instead of at the foot of the crosses. Only in winter did the place look whole, the snow covering what the ground refused to hold. The Reverend's rules became a habit. The fourth bell meant doors closed. Midnight candles meant averted eyes. Locked windows meant nothing worth seeing. In time, even the newest arrivals to Dalebridge learned the rhythm without being told. The parish did not need force to keep its silence. It needed only the Reverend's long, patient smile and the cold weight of the season pressing on every heart. And somewhere below, in the winter room, the air remained still, the frost never melting, the threshold always waiting for its next vessel. Elias Whitford believed that death left to itself was sloppy. It came too fast or too slow, smudging the soul's edges, leaving the body disheveled for its journey. To him, God's mercy was not in the living, but in the preservation of the moment just before the soul crossed. He called that instant the threshold, a breath held between two eternities, and he built his entire private theology on the idea that the body could be guided to that exact point. then locked there. In his journals the term appeared again and again: freezing grace. The winter room beneath St. Bartholomew's was no mere cellar. Its walls were thick limestone, sweating in summer and brittle with frost in winter. Elias had lined them with iron plates scavenged from a decommissioned freight wagon, sealing the seams with pitch and crushed bone to keep out moisture. The floor sloped subtly toward a drain, though the drain led nowhere, ending in a plug of packed salt. In the center stood what he called the cradle, an iron frame shaped like a shallow canoe, its interior lined with folded linen that had been soaked in meltwater from the church's rooftop icicles. The metal was always cold to the touch, even in the brief weeks when the world above thawed. Elias's process began with selection. The vessel had to be untainted, not in body alone but in temperament. A child quick to laugh, quick to fear, or prone to questions would not do. He preferred those who could stand in silence without shifting, who followed instructions without hesitation, who seemed already at peace in stillness. The chosen one would be drawn closer to the parish through small acts: an extra loaf of bread, a place near the altar, a hymn sung in private practice. The ritual itself was measured not in minutes but in changes Elias could see and feel. The first stage was the quieting, the vessel laid in the cradle, their bodies swaddled in snow-packed cloth, leaving only the face exposed. The snow was never from the ground. It was gathered from the surface of frozen rivers where the ice's purity was, in his view, closer to heaven. This cold seeped slowly into the skin, pulling the heat from the blood without shocking the heart. The second stage was the holding. Elias would remain beside the cradle, one hand on the vessel's chest, feeling for the rhythm of breath. He carried no clock. Instead, he counted the rise and fall against the beat of his own pulse. When the breaths became shallow and irregular, he would whisper prayers, not for salvation but for stillness, until the vessel's body reached the cool heaviness he sought. The final stage was the sealing. Here his method became unlike anything found in the annals of mortuary science or religious rite. He prepared a solution of crushed limestone, fine ash from the church's candle wicks, and salt, ground together until it felt like dry snow between his fingers. Using a small brass funnel, he introduced this mixture into the vessel's veins, displacing the blood slowly, replacing it with the pale, burning slurry. The veins whitened under the skin, branching into stark patterns that Elias mapped in his journal. These patterns, he wrote, were constellations of the saved, each unique, each marking the vessel as eternally within the threshold. When the sealing was complete, the vessel's body was positioned according to its purity. Some were laid supine, hands folded. Others were seated upright, eyes closed. A rare few were frozen in prayer, knees bent, hands clasped. The cradle was then emptied of snow, the body wiped clean with cloths dipped in chilled holy water, and the mouth gently pried open so that the final breath, now visible as a tiny frost crystal, remained in place. Elias did not bury his vessels. To him the earth was decaying. Instead, he kept them in the winter room, each on their own iron perch, arranged in a slow, deliberate circle facing a low, black altar. Around the altar's base, he scattered grains of the same salt-ash mixture used in sealing, believing it kept the souls from wandering. He would visit them in the nights following a new selection, sitting on a low stool, whispering passages from his Bible as if continuing a conversation interrupted only moments before. The theology he presented to his congregation bore no trace of this. His sermon spoke of patience, humility, and the mercy of God's timing. But in his private doctrine, written in neat ink and stored in a locked chest, he described freezing grace as the purest offering man could give to heaven. A soul neither living nor dead, preserved at the instant of its perfection. He believed that if he could present enough vessels at the threshold, heaven itself would open like a frost-bound door in spring. Each new vessel meant another cross in the snow-covered field, the number chosen not by age alone but by the sequence Elias saw in his constellations of veins. To the townspeople, the crosses were symbols of loss. To Elias, they were a ledger of progress. He knew precisely how many he needed. And as the winter of 1853 deepened, the number grew closer to completion. The winter of 1849 settled over Dalbridge like a locked door. Snow fell for weeks without pause, smothering the fields and swallowing the fences until the town seemed a cluster of islands adrift in a white sea. It was in that stillness Elias Whitford found the vessel he had been waiting for. His choice was a boy named Samuel Lorne, 9 years old, small for his age, with hair the color of wheat just before harvest. Samuel's parents had died 2 winters earlier in a river accident, leaving him in the care of a widowed aunt who, though kind, was often too ill to watch him closely. Elias had noticed how Samuel never fidgeted in the pews, how he could stand through an entire hymn without glancing around, how his eyes seemed fixed on something no one else could see. The selection came without ceremony. One evening, after the 4th bell, Elias sent word to Samuel's aunt that the boy would help prepare hymnals for the Sunday service. In Dalebridge, a child sent to the parish in winter was assumed to be safe until morning. The snow muffled his footsteps as Elias led him through the nave, past the altar, and down into the winter room. The boy shivered, but not from fear. Elias worked with the same care he had rehearsed in solitude. He guided Samuel into the cradle, speaking in a low, steady voice about purity and the stillness God loved best. The snow-packed linens wrapped around the boy's body hissed faintly as warmth left the fabric. Samuel's breath made small clouds in the air, each one thinner than the last. Elias kept one hand on his chest, feeling the rise and fall slow to the rhythm he sought. When the boy's skin took on the pallor of candle wax, Elias began the sealing. The limestone ash-salt mixture was fed into the veins through a narrow brass funnel, a drop at a time. Samuel did not stir. His veins whitened, branching into a pattern Elias traced with his eyes, delicate like frost on a window pane. In his journal later that night, Elias described it as the shepherd's path, the first constellation in what would become his gallery. When the process was complete, Elias positioned Samuel seated on the iron perch, hands folded, head bowed slightly forward as if in prayer. The mouth remained open just enough to hold the final crystal of breath, which glittered in the candlelight like a shard of glass. Elias remained in the winter room for hours afterward, sitting in silence with the boy, feeling the air settle around them into perfect stillness. He left only when the candles guttered out on their own. The next morning, Samuel's absence was noted but not feared. Snow had fallen heavily in the night, and people assumed he had stayed at the parish. When the aunt came to ask after him, Elias lowered his eyes and spoke of a sudden fever, quick and merciful. He told her Samuel had passed before dawn, that the body had been prepared and buried in consecrated ground. She wept quietly but did not press him. In a town where graves often went unmarked in winter, there was no reason to question why she was not shown the place. That Sunday, a new cross stood in the field behind the parish. It bore the number 9, carved so cleanly the wood looked almost polished. The townsfolk remarked on its neatness, its symmetry against the others, but no one asked to see what lay beneath it. Elias blessed the cross in front of the congregation, his voice soft, his hand steady. For those watching, it was an act of compassion. For Elias, it was the first entry in a sacred ledger. At night he returned to the winter room, speaking to Samuel in the same calm tone he had used in life. He believed the boy could hear him, that the stillness preserved in his body allowed the soul to linger just at the edge of understanding. He read from the book of John, reciting passages about eternal life and the kingdom where no decay could enter. Sometimes he thought he saw the frost crystal in Samuel's mouth shimmer as if answering him. In the weeks that followed, Elias felt no guilt, only confirmation. The vessel had been perfect, the sealing flawless, the stillness unmarred. The process worked. The field behind the parish was no longer just a resting place. It was a ledger of souls kept at the threshold, a record of his progress toward the moment when heaven's door would open. And if one vessel could be preserved, there could be more, many more. The town adjusted to the absence of Samuel Lorne as it had adjusted to every other disappearance, by folding it into the silence of winter. Children learned not to ask about the crosses. Adults learned to pass the parish without glancing toward the field. Elias learned that a smile could hold a secret so tightly that no one dared to touch it. The snow kept falling, and in the winter room the air remained perfectly still. By the winter after Samuel Lorne's preservation, Elias Whitford had begun to think of flesh the way a stonemason thought of marble. It was not simply a vessel for the soul, but a material that could be shaped, hardened, and perfected if handled with patience. The limestone-ash-salt mixture had worked beyond expectation, keeping Samuel's skin smooth and his features untouched by the creeping rot that claimed all unguarded dead. Yet Elias noticed something else. Where the mixture had traveled through the veins, it left branching white streaks beneath the skin, visible in the candlelight like pale lightning. In his journal, he called these markings constellations of grace, each unique to the vessel. He began to study them as if they were maps, believing they revealed the soul's path to God. Samuel's pattern, the shepherd's path, was delicate and straight. The second vessel, taken later that same winter, bore veins that split into jagged forks, which Elias named the Broken Crown. He recorded each pattern with careful ink sketches, writing in the margins which ones felt closer to the threshold and which seemed to resist it. But the markings faded over time. Weeks after sealing, the white lines began to soften, their clarity lost. Elias took this as an imperfection, a flaw he could not allow. Preservation was not enough. The constellations had to endure unchanged, as permanent as the soul's state. That summer, while the parish went about its ordinary labors, Elias experimented. He learned that if the salt content in his mixture was increased and ground finer, the veins took on a sharper definition. If the ash came only from the wicks of candles burned on the altar, the white became brighter. And if the limestone dust was sifted through a cloth blessed in a funeral mass, the marking stayed rigid far longer, as if frozen into the tissue. He began to call this refinement vein mapping, a sacrament in his private liturgy. The process was slow and exact. Once the vessel's breath had been reduced to the faint whisper he desired, Elias would insert the brass funnel into a vein at the inner elbow and release the slurry drop by drop. The mixture traveled outward, replacing the blood like frost creeping across a window pane. He would follow its progress by touch, fingers running along the arm, chest, and neck, pressing gently to guide it toward the heart. Sometimes, if the child's skin was pale enough, Elias could see the patterns form in real time, each branch and fork blooming under the surface. He treated these moments as sacred revelations, pausing to memorize them before continuing. When the pattern reached the face, tiny veins around the eyes would turn white, and a faint shimmer would appear along the lips. It was then that Elias knew the sealing was complete. The constellations varied greatly. Some resembled trees in winter, others fractured rivers, others still like spider webs caught in frost. Elias began to believe that each revealed the state of the soul at the instant of preservation. A clean, straight pattern meant readiness for the threshold. A tangled, knotted one meant the soul resisted stillness. In those cases, Elias adjusted the ritual, tightening the linen bindings or prolonging the cooling stage until the vessel accepted the state he sought. The gallery in the winter room grew. Samuel was joined by 3 more children over the next 2 winters, each placed on their own iron perch, arranged in the widening circle around the black altar. Elias took care that no 2 vessels touched, for fear their constellations might somehow blur together in the cold. He recorded the position of each in his ledger, noting the cross number in the field that corresponded to it. In his mind, the 2 sites, the field above and the room below, were halves of the same altar. The townsfolk noticed nothing beyond the crosses. A boy vanishing after market day, a girl not seen since choir practice. These things were spoken of in hushed tones, their weight dulled by the reverend's quiet presence at the hearth, offering prayer and bread. The field grew, and with it, Elias's conviction that his work was holy. By 1851, he had perfected the vein mapping so thoroughly that the constellations could be seen months later as clearly as the day they were made. To Elias, these were not signs of death, but of life preserved in its most perfect moment. Sometimes he would enter the winter room and trace the white lines under a vessel's skin with the back of his fingers, as if following a path on a map he alone could read. In those moments, the frost in the air felt almost warm, and the silence was so complete that even his own breath seemed too loud. Every new vessel brought him closer to what he called the Great Opening, a moment when the threshold would no longer hold him back. He imagined presenting all his constellations at once, 30 or 40 perfected souls, their white veins shining in the candlelight as heaven itself took notice. The work was methodical, scientific, yet saturated with a faith no scripture had ever spoken. And with each child, each cross, each cold night in the winter room, Elias felt that faith grew stronger, strong enough to believe that when the last constellation was drawn, the frozen door between worlds would finally open, and the silence he cherished would swallow everything. By the turn of 1851, the parish's field of crosses had grown too quickly for Dalbridge alone to explain. The townsfolk, though careful to avoid speaking of it, began to notice that some of the children marked there had not been born within the parish. Strangers' faces had joined their own in silence. Elias Whitford had widened his search. In his sermons he began to speak of Christian duty beyond the borders of the county, of the need to offer refuge to the forgotten lambs, who wandered the roads with no family to guide them. The townspeople, softened by the weight of his words, agreed to his new practice of bringing in orphans from neighboring parishes. He made the journeys himself, traveling by cart in the weeks after harvest, when the air was cold but the snows had not yet sealed the roads. He carried bread, blankets, and letters of introduction from other clergy who trusted him without question. Orphaned children, ragged, hungry, and unwanted, were easy to find along the frost-bitten outskirts of towns, huddled in workhouses or begging near mills. Elias's gentle voice and warm carriage were a promise of shelter. He never took more than one at a time, never enough to raise suspicion, and always returned by nightfall. To the parish, these children were acts of mercy. They were given clean clothes, hot food, and a bed near the warmth of the parish kitchen. But each was carefully watched from the moment they arrived. Elias measured them in ways the others could not see. How still they stood during evening prayers. How long they could hold a note without faltering. How their eyes moved when silence stretched too long. He knew within a week whether a child would become a vessel. Those chosen never remained beyond the first snowfall. Sometimes they vanished after being sent to assist the reverend in preparing the altar for winter mass. Other times they were called for private hymn practice on a night when the wind kept the town indoors. The rest of the parish saw nothing more of them, only the appearance of a new cross in the field, its number carved deep enough to catch frost in the grooves. The winter room adapted to its growing gallery. Elias built additional perches along the walls, each angled so the vessels faced the black altar. The air was kept colder now, with blocks of ice dragged from the frozen river and stacked along the walls to keep the temperature constant. He noticed that the vane constellations held even longer in the deeper cold, their white lines as bright months later as the night of sealing. He continued his vane mapping with meticulous devotion. One orphan from a mill town bore a pattern so dense and intricate that Elias named it the crown of thorns, convinced it was a sign of divine favor. Another's pattern split into 3 distinct paths, which he believed represented the Holy Trinity. These interpretations filled pages of his journal, each entry written as both scientific record and prayer. The townsfolk remained willfully blind. They saw the orphans' arrivals as the work of a saintly man and their disappearances as sad but inevitable in a world where winter claimed many. Elias reinforced this view by delivering careful eulogies, each tailored to the child's imagined virtues, weaving stories of their last days that never contradicted what little the parishioners had seen. He buried them in words before they could be missed in life. With each passing year, the field behind the parish grew more uneven, the older crosses leaning in the wind, the newer ones standing sharp and straight. Yet the symmetry never broke. each new cross placed at precise distances, forming arcs that, if viewed from above, would trace a circle around the church itself. No one in Dalebridge climbed high enough to see it. Elias's reach now extended across counties. He learned the unguarded roads, the workhouses with the weakest watch, the markets where a lone child could vanish without note. But he never took in haste. The work demanded patience, for the vessels had to be worthy of the threshold. Those who did not meet his quiet tests were left in the parish until they found other homes or wandered away. The chosen remained only until the snow fell thick enough to muffle their last breath. By the winter of 1852, the winter room held more than a dozen vessels, each standing in perpetual stillness, their white-veined patterns shining under the candlelight. Elias often stood in the center of the circle at night, eyes closed, breathing in the air that never warmed. In those moments, the silence seemed to press back against his skin as if the threshold itself were drawing closer. He told himself the great opening was no longer far away, that the day would come when he would lead all his constellations through it together, and the cold would never end. By the winter of 1852, Elias Whitford's work had become so precise that each step of the ritual unfolded with the timing of a liturgy. Yet precision meant little if the moment of the vessel's crossing could not be marked and remembered. The crosses in the field were his visible record, but Elias wanted something more, an audible seal upon the instant the soul was fixed in the threshold. The bells of St. Bartholomew's had always marked the town's rhythms. The fourth bell in late afternoon to call workers from the fields, the evening toll to summon prayer, the Sunday peal to gather the faithful. Elias, who had tended those ropes for years, knew the weight and echo of each one as intimately as his own breath. He began to experiment during the dead hours, when the streets were empty and the wind swallowed most sound. A careful hand on the rope could coax a bell to swing just enough to let the clapper kiss its side without the full peal, producing a dull, heavy note that seemed to hang lower in the air, and by striking in reverse order, beginning with the highest bell and ending with the lowest, he discovered a strange, unsettling cadence. To him it felt like the sound of descent, each note pulling the listener deeper into stillness. He called this the backward toll, and soon it became part of his sealing ritual. As the vessel's breath reached its faintest flutter, Elias would ascend from the winter room, cross the nave, and take the bell ropes in his hands. His palms, cold from the chamber below, gripped the fibers as he drew the first high note into the air. 9 chimes for the first vessel of a season, 8 for the second, and so on, each toll in reverse order, counting down to the final deep note that seemed to roll through the ground itself. The townsfolk began to notice. On certain nights when snow muffled every other sound, they would hear the bells ring in this strange backward sequence. No one could explain it. Some thought it a fault in the bell's weight, others a mistake by a sleepy altar boy. But when it happened, a quiet unease settled over the houses, and parents would urge children away from the windows. One evening, a storm raged so fiercely that the wind drowned most of the bells. Yet a farmer walking home from the tavern claimed he still heard them, not with his ears, but in his chest, each note striking like a pulse. He told no one for weeks, but when he did, his wife forbade him from passing the parish at night. Elias, for his part, saw the backward toll as more than signal. He believed it guided the vessel's soul through the moment of sealing, each descending note drawing it closer to the frozen doorway of the threshold. In his journal, he wrote that the sound threads the soul to its place, ensuring it could not drift or dissolve. He even began to match the timing of the vein mapping to the rhythm of the bells, so that the final infusion of the salt-ash mixture coincided with the last deep note. By late winter, the backward toll had become so bound to his work that he could not imagine sealing a vessel without it. He practiced during the day when the church was empty, perfecting the pull so that each note lasted the same breath's length. He adjusted the ropes, shaved the clapper edges to change the resonance, and marked the floorboards where his feet should stand for balance. It was, to him, a prayer in motion, one the town could hear but never understand. The field of crosses grew again that season. A 12 appeared after a night of heavy tolling, followed weeks later by a 5. Each time the bells had rung in reverse, their notes sinking like stones through the snowbound air. No one confronted Elias about it. His calm smile and patient explanations that the bells were simply being tested in the cold were enough to quiet any curiosity. Yet in the houses closest to the parish, the sound lodged in memory. Children lying awake could count each backward note and knew, though they could not say how, that somewhere a door was closing. They learned to pull the blankets over their heads when it began, as if the sound might enter them if they left their faces bare. Elias's great opening felt nearer now. The bells were no longer just instruments. They were part of the architecture of the ritual, their vibrations woven into the stillness below. He imagined the day when all the vessels stood in the winter room together, the backward toll ringing for each in turn, the deep final note swelling so low that even heaven would feel it. The winter of 1852 was harsher than any in memory. The river froze so deep that its surface no longer groaned under the weight of carts. It stood silent, a flat expanse of white stone. Snowbanks swallowed fences and roofs sagged under the weight of ice. It was in this deep freeze that Elias Whitford found the vessel he would remember above all others. The child came from a mill town 2 days' ride away. A boy of about 8, taken in after a fire, claimed the factory where he had been put to work. His hair was scorched short, his skin pale with soot that no amount of scrubbing seemed to erase. He was unusually quiet, watching everything with an unwavering gaze, his eyes a pale, cloudy blue that caught the candlelight like frost. From the moment Elias saw him, he imagined those eyes preserved, not simply frozen in the natural way, but transformed into something eternal, something more fitting for a soul meant to stand forever at the threshold. In his journal, he wrote that eyes were the lamps of the soul, and that a vessel whose eyes could never dim might be the perfect offering. The boy was chosen within a week. The snow was falling in hard, wind-driven sheets the night Elias led him down into the winter room. The ritual began as always. The snow-soaked linens wrapped tight, the steady cooling of the body, the measured reduction of breath. The boy's eyes stayed open through it all, fixed on some point beyond Elias's shoulder, unblinking even as the cold drew the color from his lips. When the breath slowed to the faintest trace, Elias began the sealing, feeding the limestone ash-salt mixture into the veins, watching the white lightning of the constellations branch beneath the skin. But when the vein mapping was complete, he did not move the boy to an iron perch. Instead, he kept him in the cradle and retrieved a small wooden case from a locked drawer. Inside were 2 polished glass marbles, each the size of a child's eye, hollowed at the center and filled with holy water taken from the font during the first frost of the year. Elias had spent months preparing them, heating the glass in the church stove until it softened, shaping it with slow, deliberate turns, then cooling it in snow until it hardened to a pale, translucent sheen. With a bone-handled knife, he worked with surgical care. The natural eyes were removed and placed in a shallow silver dish lined with snow. In their place, the glass marbles were set deep into the sockets, the lids pressed gently closed, so that only the faintest rim of glass showed when the eyes were at rest. Inside, the holy water remained perfectly still, refracting the candlelight into tiny cold sparks. Elias called these tears of the saved. He believed that when thawed, the marbles would release a single bead of that water, a final perfect tear marking the soul's readiness. He imagined that in the moment of the great opening, each vessel could shed such a tear at once, and heaven would see the purity of the offering. Once the replacement was complete, Elias placed the boy upright on his perch, tilting the head slightly downward so that the lids rested in a half-closed, prayerful position. In the dim light, the glass reflected no warmth, only the cold shimmer of the winter room. He stood before the vessel for a long time, whispering prayers not for the boy, but for the constellations in his veins and the water sealed behind the glass. Above, the bells rang backward, 8 notes this time, the final low toll rolling through the ground. A few townsfolk lying awake that night felt a strange pressure behind their own eyes as the sound faded, but they turned away from the thought as quickly as it came. In the weeks that followed, Elias visited the glass-eyed vessel more often than the others. Sometimes he would warm his hands near the stove upstairs, then return to the winter room and press his fingers lightly to the marbles, watching for the faintest change in the water within. Once, in the depth of January, a single droplet formed inside the left marble, floating like a pearl before settling back into stillness. Elias recorded the moment with near-fevered handwriting, calling it the first proof of the tear. The cross in the field bore the number 8, its carving so deep that the grooves held frost even when the sun briefly touched them. To the parish, it was one more marker in a long line of losses. To Elias, it was the sign of a vessel unlike any other, a soul with eyes that could never close, watching forever from the threshold. By January of 1853, the winter room held 28 vessels, each preserved in their own posture of frozen grace, each bearing the white constellations Elias had mapped with reverence. The air in the chamber was so still that the candle flames barely wavered, and the cold had deepened into a permanent season, immune to whatever weather stirred above. Elias felt the threshold pressing closer, its silent promise growing heavier with every passing day. The gallery was nearly complete, but he believed the final vessel, the 29th, must be more perfect than all the rest. He found her in a neighboring county, a deaf girl of perhaps 10, her hair the color of pale straw, her expression calm in a way that unsettled those who tried to speak with her. She had been abandoned to the parish there after her parents' deaths, left to sit by the stove and sew simple cloth strips for the altar. She did not fidget, did not startle, and her eyes, though unseeing to sound, were sharp, fixed, and unblinking when she looked at someone. Elias knew instantly. He returned for her a week later under the pretense of offering her a home in Dalebridge. She came without hesitation, wrapped in a heavy coat and carrying only a small cloth bag. The journey back was quiet. She seemed content to watch the snow sweep past the cart, her head tilted slightly as if listening to a rhythm only she could hear. In the winter room, Elias had prepared a position he had never attempted before. The cradle was unnecessary for this vessel. She would not be preserved lying down. Instead, he had constructed a standing frame of wrought iron, with manacles lined in snow-soaked linen to protect the skin from tearing as the cold stiffened her limbs. The frame was set directly before the black altar in the center of the vessel's circle, so that when she was sealed she would appear to be leading the rest in eternal prayer. The ritual began with the slow cooling. Linen bands soaked in river snow were wrapped around her torso, arms, and legs, the chill sinking into her bones without the shock of ice directly on the skin. Her eyes remained open, unblinking, her gaze steady on the altar behind Elias. He worked in silence, knowing she would hear nothing of his movement, but believing she might still sense the cadence of his steps. When her breath slowed, he began the vein mapping. The limestone-ash-salt mixture flowed through her body like a pale tide, branching into patterns that made Elias pause in awe. This was no simple constellation. Her veins formed arcs and curves that seemed to mirror the very shape of the vessel circle itself. In his journal, he would later name it the crown of the threshold, the only pattern that seemed to contain all the others. The sealing complete, he guided her into the standing frame, fastening the padded manacles at her wrists and ankles, adjusting her posture so her knees bent slightly, her head bowed just enough to suggest prayer. Her mouth was opened the smallest fraction, and the frost crystal formed between her teeth caught the candlelight like a single star. This vessel, he believed, would be the key to the great opening. She would stand at the center, her presence binding the circle of souls together, their constellations uniting into a single offering. In his mind, he could already hear the backward toll, 29 notes in perfect descent, echoing down into the winter room, vibrating through the perches until the threshold shuddered open. Above, the snow fell heavy and unbroken. That night he climbed to the bell ropes and rang the backward toll with a precision he had never achieved before. The notes sank into the frozen earth, their echoes lingering longer than the air should have allowed. Some townsfolk woke in the dark, convinced they had been called to something but unable to say what. The cross in the field appeared by dawn. 10, carved into the wood, the groove so deep the blade marks seemed to cut into the grain's memory. To the parish, it was simply another winter loss, mourned in the quiet way all the others had been. But for Elias, the 29th throne was filled, and the circle was complete. He spent the following nights in the winter room, moving among the vessels, tracing the white patterns beneath their skin, whispering their numbers in sequence. He would pause before the deaf girl, bowing his head as if to an altar. Soon, he thought, soon the silence would no longer be contained to this room. it would spill outward, freezing the world in a moment of perfect grace. It was Thomas Hale who saw it, an altar boy of 14, thin as kindling, with a habit of moving silently through the parish so as not to draw the reverend's notice. He had served under Elias for 3 winters, carrying coal to the sacristy stove, filling the font, trimming candle wicks until his fingers were permanently wax-stained. He knew the rhythms of the parish better than anyone, knew when Elias would be in the nave, when he would descend to the cellar, and how long he would remain there. It was on a night when the snow pressed hard against the doors and the wind rattled the bell ropes in their frames. Elias had left the nave for the cellar, locking the door behind him as always, but the storm had swelled the wood and the latch did not catch fully. Thomas, sent to fetch more candles from the supply shelf, noticed the faint seam of light beneath the door. Curiosity, a dangerous thing in Dalebridge, overcame him. He pressed his hand to the latch. It yielded with a reluctant groan. The air beyond was colder than any he had felt inside a building, so cold it seemed to seize his breath in his throat. He crept down the narrow stairs, the stone steps slick with a thin sheen of frost. The light grew stronger, flickering from the candles set in iron holders along the wall. The smell was not decay, there was none, but a sharp mixture of cold iron, salt, and something faintly sweet like melted snow. When he reached the bottom, he stopped so abruptly his knees locked. The winter room stretched before him, a wide chamber whose walls glittered faintly with frost. In a perfect circle stood 29 figures, children, all different ages, all dressed in white garments that shimmered in the candlelight. Some sat on iron perches, hands folded, others stood in rigid frames, a few were positioned in kneeling prayer. Their skin was pale as porcelain, their lips faintly parted to reveal the tiniest glint of frost within. And beneath that skin, like veins drawn in chalk, ran strange branching patterns that glowed faintly in the cold. At the center stood the deaf girl, bound upright, her head bowed in eternal supplication. Her half-closed eyes reflected the candlelight with a dull, glassy sheen. Thomas's stomach turned when he realized they were not eyes at all, but smooth, pale orbs that caught the light like frozen beads of water. He backed against the wall, his breath fogging the air. None of the vessels moved, yet the room felt crowded with presence, as if each figure were aware of him, holding its silence until he was gone. Elias's journal lay open on the black altar in the center, a quill resting across the page. Thomas could see the sketches, delicate white patterns branching through drawn limbs, and numbers beside each, the same numbers carved into the crosses outside. A sound made him freeze. From the far corner, Elias emerged from the shadows, holding a small brass funnel and a bowl of crushed white powder. His eyes met Thomas's, and the smile that spread across his face was slow, patient, and without surprise. "You shouldn't be here," Elias said, his voice low but unhurried, as if speaking to a child caught somewhere they ought not to be. Thomas's legs felt heavy, but instinct pushed him up the stairs. He did not hear Elias follow, did not hear anything at all until the latch clicked shut behind him. He fled into the snow, the cold stinging his lungs, his mind reeling with the image of the circle below. By the time he reached the sheriff's house, his words were a jumble of frost and breath. He spoke of children frozen like statues, of strange white veins, of glass eyes that seemed to watch him even after he turned away. The sheriff listened in silence, then told him to go home. By morning, the story had shrunk to a fever dream in the town's telling. Just a boy spooked by shadows in the cellar. No one questioned Elias, and no one looked for the latch Thomas swore had been open. But Thomas knew what he had seen, and the knowledge clung to him like the cold in that room, a chill that would not fade. The thaw came early that spring, sudden and violent, as if winter had been holding its breath for too long. Rain fell for 3 days without pause. The river swelled against its banks, and the ground softened into dark, sucking mud. At St. Bartholomew's, the stone foundation groaned under the weight of meltwater. On the 4th morning, a section of wall along the parish's northern side collapsed with a sound like a slow roar, sending a plume of dust and shattered stone into the churchyard. The breach opened directly into the winter room. It was the gravedigger, Elias Rowe, not a relative of the Reverend who saw it first. He had come to inspect the field after the rain began undercutting the newer crosses. The hole yawned wide enough to show the edge of the black altar within, the flicker of candles guttering in the draught. From where he stood, Rowe could see pale shapes in the shadows, rows of them, faces tilted in strange angles, eyes closed or half open. He stumbled back and called for others. Within an hour, half the town had gathered in the churchyard, their boots sinking into the sodden earth. No one stepped forward at first. The opening gaped like a wound no one wanted to touch. Then the sheriff, pale but determined, climbed through, followed by 2 men with lanterns. Gasps and muffled cries rippled through the crowd as the lantern light revealed the gallery. The children stood and sat exactly as Thomas Hale had seen them. 29 in a perfect circle, dressed in white, skin unblemished, veins mapped in white branches that caught the light like frost. Some were seated, hands folded, others knelt in postures of prayer. And in the center, the deaf girl stood bound in her iron frame, her glass eyes dim in the shifting light. The air was so cold it stung their lungs, and though the candles burned, their flames seemed fragile, as if struggling against the stillness. There was no smell of decay, only the dry sharpness of salt and iron. The sheriff's lantern caught the open journal on the black altar, the neat handwriting, the sketches of vein patterns, and the numbers matching the crosses in the field above. Words spread like fire in wet wood, slow to start, then impossible to stop. Women covered their mouths. Men pulled children close. Some claimed to recognize faces, though none could say when they had last seen them alive. Others whispered prayers, afraid that speaking too loud might disturb whatever strange state held the vessels upright. And Elias Whitford was nowhere to be found. The sheriff ordered a search, but the Reverend's quarters were empty, his trunk gone, the bed neatly made. A loaf of bread sat on the table beside a mug of water, as if he had intended to return for a simple meal. But no one saw him leave town, and no tracks marked the muddy road in any direction. It was as though he had stepped out of the parish and vanished into the rain. By evening, the winter room had been emptied. The vessels, still rigid, still cold to the touch, were carried up into the churchyard and placed in rows. Whatever Elias had done to them, it had preserved them so well that the youngest looked as though they had only just fallen asleep. The constellations in their veins gleamed faintly under the gray daylight, and no one dared touch them for long. The decision of what to do with the bodies fell quickly to the town elders, who spoke in hushed tones behind the locked doors of the meeting hall. The conclusion was reached not with agreement, but with exhaustion. The children would be buried behind the parish, each grave marked with a simple cross bearing the number from Elias's ledger. There would be no names, no mention of the manner of their preservation. The stated reason was to spare the family's grief. The unspoken truth was that no one wanted to say aloud what they had seen. By the time the last grave was filled, the rain had stopped. The field of crosses now stood in full, 29 markers in uneven arcs that curved toward the church as if drawn by some invisible tether. The winter room was sealed with brick and mortar, the black altar dismantled and burned in the churchyard. No, one took the journal. It had vanished with Elias. In the weeks that followed, Dalbridge returned to its old rhythms. The bells rang forward again. The parish reopened for Sunday service under a visiting clergyman, and the townsfolk avoided looking at the crosses when passing by. But the air seemed different, sharper somehow, and those who had stepped into the winter room carried a quiet weight that no prayer could lift. Elias Whitford had left nothing behind but his vessels and his silence. Yet for those who had seen his work, it felt as though that silence still lingered, coiled somewhere just out of sight, waiting for the right cold to return. The burial of the 29 vessels took place without a sermon. No hymns, no readings, no tolling of the bells. The elders feared that any ceremony would turn the event into a spectacle, and worse, might give people courage to speak of what they had seen in the winter room. Instead, the graves were dug in a single long trench behind the parish, far from the older churchyard where generations of Dalbridge's dead rested under stones bearing their names. The trench was wide enough to hold the rows of preserved bodies without touching, their white garments still clean despite the days above ground. The constellations in their veins were visible until the last moment. Some glistened faintly when the light struck them through breaks in the clouds, and a few of the men digging swore they could feel the cold radiating from the bodies even after hours in the damp spring air. The deaf girl was lowered into the center, still upright, her manacles removed but her posture unaltered, head bowed as if in final prayer. Each grave marker was an unadorned wooden cross, its only inscription the number from Elias Whitford's ledger. The elders insisted on the numbering. No names were to be recorded. Families who claimed one of the lost were told privately which number was theirs and warned not to carve more upon it. The official reason was to protect the dignity of the dead. The true reason was to cut the story out at the root. Without names, there would be no one to remember, no one to demand answers, no one to speak of Elias's doctrine of freezing grace. A quiet ordinance was passed within a week, its wording vague but its meaning unmistakable. No grave within the township shall bear markings beyond the year and the age at death. It was called the Law of Silent Graves, and though it applied to all burials, it existed only to mask the 29. The townspeople accepted it without protest. Those who had entered the winter room wanted the memory sealed as firmly as the door the masons bricked over. The black altar, once dismantled, was burned in a pit far from the parish ground. The ashes were scattered in the river under cover of night, the current carrying them out of Dalebridge before morning. No one spoke of the vain constellations again, though some who had seen them found their eyes tracing shapes in frost on their windows come winter, unable to stop. For Thomas Hale, the boy who had first looked, the silence became a sentence. The sheriff had warned him that speaking further would only do harm, but it was the stares of the townsfolk that truly silenced him, half pity, half fear. He avoided the parish altogether, taking work in the fields, his gaze fixed on the ground whenever the bells rang. The crosses weathered quickly in the months that followed. Spring rain darkened the wood, summer heat cracked it, and by autumn the earliest ones had begun to lean. Yet the newer markers, those cut and placed in the final days, remained straight and pale, as if some trace of Elias's preservations had seeped into the grain. By year's end, the winter room was nothing more than a sealed chamber beneath the parish, its door hidden behind plaster and paint. The visiting clergyman avoided mentioning it, and in time, newcomers to Dalebridge never heard of it at all. The story of the reverend who smiled too long sank into the ground with his vessels, replaced by smaller, safer tales the town could bear to tell. But among the oldest residents, the field of crosses was never just a field. They walked past it quickly, eyes fixed ahead, lips pressed thin. They obeyed the law of silent graves without question, knowing that the law had not been written for the living. It had been written for the dead, to keep them unnamed, unspoken, and undisturbed. Nearly 40 years passed before anyone touched the winter room again. Dalebridge had changed in small ways. The road was better cut, a telegraph line ran to the station, and a new generation had grown without hearing the name Elias Whitford. The field of crosses behind the parish had thinned under time. Storms had knocked some flat, rot had taken others, until only a few weathered markers leaned among the weeds. The law of silent graves remained in the township ledgers, but by then no one remembered why it had been written. It was a team of restoration workers who broke the seal. The parish was to be reinforced against further foundation collapse, and part of the northern wall had to be rebuilt from the inside. They found the brick doorway by accident, its outline faint beneath flaking plaster. When the first stone came loose, a rush of air spilled into the nave, cold and sharp despite the summer heat, carrying a dryness that burned the nose. Lanterns revealed the chamber beyond. The winter room had been stripped of its vessels long ago, but its walls still glittered with frost etched deep into the stone. The black altar was gone, yet a faint dark circle marked the floor where it had stood. Around it, in a perfect ring, pale lines stained the stone, branching, twisting patterns that could not be scrubbed away. The workers thought at first they were mineral deposits from the thaw, until one of them traced the shapes and realized they were too precise, too deliberate. They looked like the vain constellations described in the stories the elders had never told aloud. The air inside never warmed, no matter how long the doorway stood open. Tools left in the chamber overnight came out rimed with frost. The floor was dry, yet footsteps left no prints in the dust, as if the cold itself erased them. The oldest worker, a man whose grandfather had been a boy during the winter of 1853, refused to enter at all. He stood in the nave, hat in hand, muttering that the room had been sealed for a reason and ought to remain so. Word of the find spread quickly. This time there was no reverend to charm the town into silence, but there was still hesitation in the air. Some wanted the room destroyed outright, the stone dismantled and scattered in the river like the altar's ashes. Others argued for leaving it untouched, turning it into a memorial for the unnamed children whose graves lay forgotten behind the parish. In the end, compromise won out. The chamber would remain intact, but the doorway would be sealed again after a small plaque was placed outside, bearing only the inscription, "In memory of the lost, whose ages were known but whose names are held by God." Yet not all traces of Elias's work could be buried under mortar. The vein-like stains on the stone refused to fade no matter how much they were scrubbed or chipped. Lantern light caught them just so, and for a moment they seemed to shine faintly as if the frost of decades past still clung to them. A mason swore that in the center of the ring where the deaf girl had once stood, the cold was sharper, biting through gloves in seconds. Outside, the crosses that remained leaned like tired sentinels, their numbers worn smooth. Weeds choked the field, but nothing rooted in the exact spots where the original markers had stood, as though the soil rejected any attempt to cover its memory. Children dared each other to step between them on autumn nights, but always ran before they reached the center. The town never found Elias Whitford. Records in other counties showed no trace of his name. Some claimed he drowned in the river the night the cellar was discovered. Others whispered that he had left Dalbridge long before, taking with him the knowledge of how to keep a soul at the threshold. A few swore they saw him decades later in another parish, unchanged, smiling the same slow smile. In the end, the winter room became a story again, this time told in murmurs to warn against curiosity, against trusting what hides behind gentleness. The law of silent graves remained on the books until the turn of the century, when it was quietly removed. But the graves behind St. Bartholomew's were never altered, their anonymity preserved by habit rather than law. For those who had stepped into the winter room either in 1853 or decades later, the place never truly let them go. It lingered in the back of their minds, in the patterns frost made on glass in January, in the way bells sounded on still nights. Some said they heard the backward toll again, faint and far away when the air was cold enough to burn in the lungs. True evil, they came to realize, was not loud. It did not rage or announce itself. It waited. It froze the moment it desired and kept it patient and unblinking until the world forgot to look. Elias Whitford had built his silence well, so well that even when the stones gave way, it stepped back into the cold without a sound. What do you think? Could it happen again?